The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jamie McKean with the Success Group, and I'll be introducing shortly Jeremy Wilson to go through the presentation today. Just before we do get started, I'd just like to check that everything's working on a technology front to make sure that you can see the presentation and you can hear me as well. So you'll see a questions box there. If you could please just quickly put in the questions box to let me know that you can both hear me and see me, that would be fantastic. Okay, Lockie, thank you very much for letting me know there. So I'm going to assume that everyone, if one can see me, I'm going to assume everyone can hear and see me. So we'll make a start, and I'm going to introduce Jeremy Wilson, Chief Strategist of Success Group, to go through today making your business sale ready, even if you don't want to sell. Jeremy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to our webinar this afternoon from a reasonably wet and miserable looking Auckland. We'll have a couple of stops for questions as we go through the webinar today. And as Jamie's just mentioned to you previously, if you can type those questions into the question box, I'll revert back to Jamie on a number of occasions just to see what questions we have as we go through the presentation. What I'm looking at doing today is going through a reasonably simple outline of what, in effect, sale ready, or to give it its more common term, succession planning, is all about. I'm going to start with the concept of what sale ready is, just so that we're all on the same page. Move on to a little bit of data. Being an accountant, I'm always going to throw a few numbers at you, so I'm going to give you a little bit of market research. And I'll start discussing some options that business owners might consider in terms of getting their business sale ready. Moving on to describe the process in detail so that you know exactly what we're talking about. And finally, wrapping up the presentation today with a special offer for all those who are attending. Now, I envisage this presentation should take somewhere around 25 to 35 minutes. So we should have ample time to finish within the allotted time. Right, so let's get started. What is sale ready? Well, it's very, very simple. It is simply the transition of the business in its current state from its current owner to the new owner. Now, we haven't defined who the new owner is, and I'll be coming back to that. But the trick here is to maximize the value that we get for the business. We've probably all been across businesses where that business is totally dependent on one or two key people. When those one or two key people leave, what happens to the value of the business? As we know, it goes with those people. Our job is to make sure that we actually have value in the business that we can maintain, and better still, we can actually sell to a prospective purchaser. So I'll be talking today about what some of those purchasers might be looking for and how we can actually go about maximising the value. And it won't be, hopefully, what you're expecting from a typical accountant. It is not all about the bottom line. It is definitely about something else. And we'll find out more about that shortly. Now, I used to use a wonderful business coach called Simon Mundell from results.com, and I've got a little quote up there from Simon, and that's why you might have noticed the title for the presentation said, Getting Your Business Ready for Sale Even If You Don't Want to Sell It. And I truly believe that what Simon is saying there is that once you actually have a true business, and I'll compare that name to a job. A business, the value stays with the business. A job, the value goes with the person. Once you have a true business that is ready for sale, it's an absolute joy to run. The analogy here would be, for instance, you decide to go and buy a house tomorrow. You've bought that house. You spend the next few years doing up the gardens, the landscaping, the bathroom, the kitchen. You've increased the value of your house. Now, do you have to sell that house? No, of course you don't. Is it a much more pleasurable house to live in? And have you added value to your property? Yes, you have. That's what we're trying to do when we're talking about getting a business sale ready. I need to counter that thought, though, with the second quote. Now, this is from an accountant, and it's actually a very relevant quote. If you want to get your business ready for sale, you're not going to do it in 1 or 2 weeks. It's going to take time. It's going to take planning. And it's a matter of when should we start to actually have our business ready for sale. When we've got a buyer? Probably a long, long time before that. So let's look at some statistics which actually indicate what sort of businesses are going to potentially be on the market in the next few years. Now, the statistic I'd like you to focus on there is the one second down, the number of business owners aged 50 plus. That's almost 2/3 of New Zealand businesses. And then if we look at the statistic at the very bottom, how many businesses actually have a plan ready in place to get their business's value maximised? How many have a sale-ready plan? Now, you don't have to be too good with numbers to see that there's a huge chasm of a gap between the number of businesses that potentially could be up for sale within the next 5 years and the number of businesses who are actually ready to get their business for sale in the next 5 years. It could well be that a lot of people out there who believe that their retirement fund, their superannuation is their business, could be in for a fairly nasty surprise if they do not plan to get their business ready for sale and maximising their value. So, let's look at a couple of options. What can we do? Now, well, we could do what a lot of New Zealand businesses do. We could do nothing. We'll keep trading, and hopefully someone's going to knock on our door with a great big wad of cash. We'll all be happy, and we can ignore everything I'm about to tell you. Maybe not. We could maybe look at selling everything. Maybe we've got some plant and equipment, and just simply by selling that plant and equipment, we'll realise all we need to be able to retire and lead a comfortable existence. Once again, I think maybe not. Possibly we could look at transferring the business to a particularly important employee or even a family member. And I'll come back to family members in a moment, because that is normally the place where most businesses focus their attention, on leaving the business to the son, to the daughter, or whomever. I'll come back to the family member. What about if we just sold to an independent, a buyer, maybe the supplier, or even the competitor? What could we add to that competitor's business that they don't already have to make them pay a premium for our business? Now we're beginning to think about the buyer, and we're beginning to plan. We could have a strategic buyer. Now, what do I mean by that? Many years ago, a business was sold in New Zealand, and when businesses sell, they quite often sell on what we call a multiple of EBIT. Now, that could sound like gobbledygook to non-accountants. EBIT, very, very loosely, stands for net profit before tax and interest. Very, very loosely. And what we generally do as accountants is we take that wonderful number, we multiply it by another number, somewhere around 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and that ends up being the value. Now, in this particular case, that little number that we were talking about, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, was actually a 12. This particular business got 12 times its EBIT as its selling price. Why? Because the buyer was a strategic buyer. They wanted to set up in New Zealand. They didn't want to go through all the costs of acquiring land and buildings. It was easier and simpler for them to buy infrastructure that was already in place. So they became a very strategic buyer. The business therefore sought out a particular person to buy, to sell the business to, and ended up with a 12 times multiple. Oh, and you might see there's a little box on the right, which I don't think we should ever ignore. That is also another option we could consider with our business. How many of you listening to this webinar, I wonder, could actually imagine your business as a public company? Believe it or not, most of the people who are attending this webinar could actually go down that pathway should they desire. It's an interesting thought to leave you on. let's go back and let's have a little think about family, shall we? They are going to be one of the most important aspects of getting our business sale ready. In effect, a lot of what we do in life, we do for our family. So they are the most important people for us to actually start communicating with, listening to, letting them in on what our thoughts and our plans are. But who else is important? Well, what about your employees? How would your team of 100 employees feel if all of a sudden they found that the business owner had moved on? How do you think the people at Apple are feeling after hearing that Steve Jobs is moving on? Using that same example, how do you think some of Apple's suppliers, bankers, lenders, and customers are feeling? Now, we all look on Apple as being a very successful business and a wonderful, wonderful product supplier. But at the end of the day, question mark, is it Apple or is it Steve Jobs? These are the sort of issues we need to go through with our family, with our employees, with our suppliers, our bankers and our lenders and our customers, and let us not forget our professional advisors. So we end up everyone knowing exactly what their role is, what their part is, and who's doing what and what the outcomes will be. So this is not something that is done behind closed doors with secret little squirrel messages going from one person to another person, and all of a sudden our suppliers and employees find out that the business has changed ownership. It doesn't work that way. Now, let's think even more about family. Right? The first thing most business owners think of is, right, I'll sell it to my oldest, my youngest, my son, my daughter, whatever. First question I've got, does that person or persons actually want to run the business? I mean, if you look back in time, a lot of New Zealand businesses tend to do quite well for the first generation. They pass the business down to the second generation. It doesn't do quite so well, and sometimes by the time it gets to the third generation, the business is no longer in existence. And for those of us who are old enough and ugly enough to remember, go back in time and think about a business called Milne & Choice. Think about a business called LD Nathans. Where are they now? Were they second generation or third generation? We might like trying to keep the business in the family. Sometimes it's actually short-term thinking. What about the rest of the family? If I pass the business down to my oldest son or daughter, what about my youngest son and daughter? Are they going to be disadvantaged? Do they think that the oldest is the best person to be running the business? Is it better to sell the business independently? Should I be going to an organisation like Remax and saying, guys, go and sell the business, give me a pot of cash, and I'll divvy that up between the family? What about our wonderfully important employers, suppliers, and customers? What if I bring in my oldest son and the employees can't stand the person? The suppliers think that my oldest son is a complete waste of time, and the customers vote with their feet. Well, I'm not doing anyone any favours, and just imagine what I've done for the value of my business for the rest of my family. Is my oldest son or daughter capable of running the business? Often a question that's never asked. We assume they will be. Do they actually have the skills? And almost as important, are we, as the business owners, actually prepared to share the secrets and let go? Now, those are little questions that I want you to ponder. And I want you to think about a typical business, a typical family-owned New Zealand business, and just wonder whether that business is best off being a family-owned business or not. And is there an alternative? Well, I'd like to put on the screen one option for people to consider, and that is we don't hand over the ownership of the business. We actually keep the ownership of the business for all of the family. But that oldest son, and no, that's not my oldest son, but that oldest son now receives an incentive-based salary package based on growing the value of the business. He benefits by additional remuneration. The rest of the family, including himself, benefit by the fact that the value of the business is growing. So this is one option where instead of actually handing over the whole kit and caboodle, we actually just hand over the management control, thereby avoiding a lot of the problems that we were talking about before. What are some of the other problems that we need to consider? Now, I quite like the analogy of whether we're trying to be an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff or a fence at the top. And if we're clever at planning, we will always be the fence at the top. We need to start thinking about what if. What if this happens? What if this happens? And start putting in place plans to make sure that the business's value is not impacted. So ask yourself the question, you're the key income producer for the business. What happens to the business if you are literally hit by a bus? Maybe you're in partnership and your partner wants out, and your partner's been the rainmaker, responsible for bringing in all the new customers. God forbid, you end up having a divorce, and now all of a sudden we're dealing with your ex-partner's accountant arguing over the value in a business. Maybe we've got a key staff member that we want to give a stake in the business to, but we don't know how to do it. These are all issues that we can actually work our way through very, very simply. I remind you of the same sort of logic we were going through before in terms of how would the business survive? What would the banks think? Would the staff actually be up to it? What would the customers say? Now remember, a few slides back we talked about talking to these people before we did anything rather than seeing the reactive reaction after we've done something. Remember, getting your business sale ready is all about planning and communication. Now, we've gone through the theory, we've had a look at a few statistics, we've discussed potentially who's going to be involved, and we've even talked a little bit about how we should treat the family and other members of the family. Let's have a look at a few nuts and bolts in terms of what actually is involved in getting a business sale ready. Right, well, for a start, and I'm going to explain each of these in a minute, we're going to determine if there is a value gap in our business. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. We're then going to focus on planning the business, making sure that we are doing today what we need to achieve our goals in the next 3, 4, or 5 years. We're going to have budgets and cash flow forecasts going so we can actually see what our bank balance is likely to be as we go through this process. We're going to make sure that our structure is bulletproof. And when an accountant talks about structure, they're talking about things like companies, trusts, superannuation, and I'll cover that in some detail later on in the webinar. And naturally, of course, we're going to need some people to help us through this process who have done it before and who can generate the sort of value that we're looking for. So let's start with that first point, the business value gap. Now, you may remember back in the old days of financial planning, people would knock on your door and say, right, you're going to retire when you're 65 and then you're going to live until you're 80 and you're going to need X dollars a day to live off. So here's an insurance policy that's going to provide you with that income for the rest of your life. Well, in a strange way, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're actually saying to ourselves, what is my business currently worth? Now, a lot of people don't actually have that information at their fingertips. What does it need to be worth? Now, that's not an easy question to answer by yourself, hence we involve the family. When do we need it to be worth that much? Therefore, we've determined the gap. Let's say our business is worth $1 million today and we need it to be worth $2 million in 3 years' time. Straight away, we know that we've got a value gap of $1 million that we need to address by putting in place certain strategies and processes over the next 3 years. If we don't know what that gap is, then it's going to make it very, very difficult to be able to target something which we don't even know what it is. Now, I've put a little slide up for you to look at, and I want you to focus on 2 items. I mentioned EBIT before, and that stands for earnings before interest and tax, or I've said, roughly speaking, it's net profit before tax and interest. You'll see that there's that number I was talking about before, the multiplier. You might remember I was going 1, 2, 3, and one business actually sold for a multiplier of 12. Now, a typical accountant is going to focus on EBIT because that's what we're good at. We can grow profits. We can grow bottom lines. We're good at that. So in this case, we've actually grown this business's EBIT from 100 to 150,000. We've grown it by a massive 50%. And yet, the value of the business has gone up by more than 200%. Why? Because we really, really want our mentors to be focusing on the second item, the multiplier. It's all very well increasing EBIT, but if I could increase the multiplier, if I could move it from a 3 to a 3.5 to a 4, imagine what it's doing to my value of the business. And the great thing about the business value is the majority of the proceeds that we receive from selling a business are free from tax. And I say the majority, 9 times out of 10, the biggest factor in a sale price is goodwill. And mostly, people are not taxed on the receipt of goodwill. Our job, therefore, is to maximise goodwill. We maximise that through increasing the multiplier. We have a checklist of approximately 70 strategies that we put in place for a business to move that multiplier from 3 to 4 to 5 and so on. All right? So what are some of the things that we actually focus on? Well, is the business growing? Is it profitable? How efficient is it? What sort of risk management is there in place should something go wrong? Would location actually have an impact on the multiplier of the business? What about the team? What about the length of the lease? What about? Those are the items that we need to focus on to really ramp up the value of your business. So let's talk a little bit more about how we're going to do that. Now, when you guys decided to come along to this webinar today, you actually had a plan. You knew where you were, you knew where you wanted to be, and you knew at what time you needed to be there. You had a plan. And how many businesses do you come across that actually do exactly the same for their own internal systems, policies, and procedures? How many people do you know of that have a detailed business plan? Now, I meet new customers on a regular basis, and I can honestly say to you that if I was meeting 100 customers a day, at most one of those would probably have a business plan. People don't plan. They just do not. They don't see a need for it. They don't see value in it. And yet, what is the biggest asset that we are probably ever going to own when we're in business? It's probably going to be our business. We plan for everything else, but we don't plan the business. Well, what we've done is we've tried to make planning simple and easy. So what we've done is we've broken down the traditional 20-page business plan, which goes into the bottom drawer and is never to be seen again, into a one-page, and I'm cheating when I say that because it's actually an A3 page, so you could argue it's 2 pages, but let me get away with 1 page, into a one-page plan which is solely focused on execution. Now, we start our planning process with some fundamental parts of business. Where are we? Right? Just like you figured out where you were when you were coming to this webinar, we need to do the same thing with the business. So how do we figure out where a business is at? Well, here we do something called SWOT and test. Now, SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Political, economic, social, and technological is what test stands for. Now, those are the factors that we then review. And we say, okay, so what are the strengths and the opportunities of this business? Where are the weaknesses? What are the threats? We now have a very good understanding of what the business is and where it's at. We then work on determining where it's going. Now, you might see the third box down, it's got 4 letters in it, and they stand for big, hairy, audacious goal. Now, I'll give you an analogy for this. Imagine your business, you're in the business of mountaineering, and someone comes up to you and says, right, what sort of pitons do we need to use? What sort of ropes are we going to use, etc., etc.? Actually, the only question that you're interested in answering first and foremost is, which mountain am I going to climb? Once you know which mountain you're going to climb, then everything else becomes a detail. Business planning is exactly the same. What is your BHAG? What is your mountain top for your business? Where will it be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years' time? Now, I remember reading an article on, Henry Ford. And Henry Ford decided that he wanted to democratize the automobile. All right, they were his words. He wanted everyone to have a car. This was in a time when the only thought that was going through most people's minds was, how do I make my horse go faster? And Henry Ford had this BHAG, this big, hairy, audacious goal. He knew what his mountaintop looked like. He knew what he needed to do to get there. And no one else would have had that same ability or that same dream. Your BHAG has a lot of your passion in it as a business owner. It is a bit of your dream. But you can't plan unless you know what that BHAG is. So we've done the SWOT, we've done the BHAG, we know where we are, where we've got to go to. We then need some rules of engagement. How are we going to conduct ourselves along this climb up this mountain? Those rules of engagement I like to call the core values. Those are things which are intrinsic to the organisation and will be there for the life of the organisation. They are things that you might think of such as honesty, integrity, professionalism, leadership, humour, imagination. What are the key characteristics of your business, of you, of your best employees that you would hire and fire upon? Would you fire someone because they were dishonest? Would you fire someone because they didn't have a sense of humour? Those are core values. They're different for every business, but they determine how we make business decisions. So we've determined where we're at, where we're going, rules of engagement. Now what we need to do is set base camps along our climb up that mountain. So we know the pinnacle might be 10, 15 years away. We need a base camp at maybe 3 to 5 years. We need another base camp at maybe 12 months away. And what we then do is we move into the actual plan itself. Here's my one-page plan. You'll see on the left, we have our core values. And as you read left to right, you start beginning to see that the plan gets more and more focused on execution. We say, why are we in business? What is our big, hairy, audacious goal? Where do we need to be in 3 to 5 years' time? Where do we need to be in 1 year's time? Moving on to the second page, where do we need to be in the next 90 days? This is where we get execution, because we focus our team on the 90 days. We don't have to focus them on the 3 to 5 years. We just have to say, this is where we're heading, guys, and this is what we need to do in the next 90 days. But how do we how do we encourage people to support us along that journey? First things first, looking at that pyramid, you'll see that at the very bottom of the pyramid are the core values. Right? They are fundamental to our business. They are going to be with that business forever. Now, why we're in business is the purpose. That revolves around you, that revolves around me, the leader of the business. Then we're going to determine targets, 3 to 5 years, next year, next quarter, next week, tomorrow. This is where we get execution. Now look at the box on the bottom right, meeting rhythm. This is how we actually encourage execution. What we do here is we focus on having a meeting every 90 days with our team to look at the business plan, redefine the strategy, make sure everything's on target. We meet with our team on a monthly basis to make sure that what we're supposed to be doing during the 90 days is happening. We focus the team in a weekly meeting on ensuring that any gaps between our execution are actually being remedied. And daily, we focus on unblocking our team members so that they are fully productive and efficient. So a lot of people say, oh, I hate meetings, they're a waste of time. The trick is to make meetings productive and efficient so you end up with an effective organisation. Now, you know you're talking to an accountant, and so you're never going to have a chat with me without having the word budgeting thrown at you. What's the budget? Well, guess what? All it is a plan converted into dollars and cents. Now, there's an old management saying, what you can measure, you can manage. You might remember before I said that if I met 100 new prospects in a day, one of them would have a business plan. Well, guess what? Probably only 2 of them would have a budget, and very few of them, in fact, none of them, would probably have a cash flow forecast. And cash is king. So what we need to do is we need to take into account in our budget things like how quickly we pay people, how quickly we get paid, that beloved concept of taxation, loan repayments, drawings. Where's the cash going? At the end of the day, we can't grow a business unless we've got sufficient cash. So it's no longer good enough just to have a budget. We actually need to move that budget into a budget and a cash flow forecast, and we need to measure and manage against both. That would be budgets and cash flow on a regular basis. The regularity would depend on each individual business, but I dare suggest that it's probably going to be more often than monthly. Structure. So we've talked about the gap, the business value gap. We've talked about the plan, how we're going to close that gap. We've talked about the budgets and the cash flows that we're going to measure our progress along the pathway to closing that gap. Now let's have a look at the structure. Now, the business that we're talking about is shown in number 2. That's the normal business operating company. Now, in most cases, that is owned by, in typical sense, Mr. and Mrs. in their own names. Well, no, not in this case. We're actually going to have the business owned by a trust. The trust is going to be for the benefit of all of the family. Now, the trust is going to have what we call a corporate trustee. And a corporate trustee is an added level of protection that we would suggest most businesses should have when we are talking about trusts owning businesses. That corporate trustee gives us what I would call a belt and braces approach to make sure that the asset is as safe as possible. Now you'll notice, for instance, that the trust also owns the business assets, but it rents them back to the business operating company. So what actually does the operating company have in it? Not a lot. We've taken most of the assets out, we've left it as a shell, the income starts flowing through into the family trust via the assets, via dividends, and it might even start building up surplus funds. That's where box number 3 comes into it. If as we're closing that value gap, we actually end up with surplus funds, what are we going to do with them? And here what I'm suggesting is, as we move along the sale-ready process, we may even be able to consider having some external investments building up with the surplus cash flows, which can then add more value to the family trust over time. Now, boxes 6 and 7, just for those of you who realised I haven't mentioned them, those are the other assets, the non-business assets. It's the family home. It's the bank investments. It's everything that is very safe. Now, can you see that there's virtually no connection between box 2 and box 7? That is absolutely critical. That's what we're talking about when we discuss asset protection. Now, this might take you a while to get your head around, but it's reasonably straightforward from an accountant and a legal perspective. What we're really trying to do here is separate out the business risk from the family assets and make sure that we maximise the value of the business. Could we get resistance along the way, though? Could we have people saying things like, well, my business is my life? Well, question, if this person's business is their life, do they have a business or do they have a job? What about succession is not a priority right now? Well, I'm very impressed because this person obviously has the ability to tell the future. They know exactly what's going to happen, and so they have no need for succession. And good luck to them. Personally, I cannot tell the future, and I would rather make sure I plan for all eventualities. I have no potential successors. Well, that sounds like we should actually start trying to find some. And this is where we would use organisations, as I mentioned before, such as REMAX, to start trying to assist in this process. It sounds time-consuming. Well, intentionally, I want it to sound time-consuming. I actually want people to realise that this is a very serious process that cannot be done in a haphazard fashion. We need to plan it, and we need to do it properly. I hear the top one quite a lot. The recession has affected my business, and I don't think I can afford to retire yet. What's that person actually saying? I have a value gap. I'm not quite sure how big it is, and I don't really know what to do about it. So how about we determine what it is and start putting in place some actions to make it happen? I don't want to spend money on expensive advisors, and rightly so. You do want to spend money, though, on people who can increase the value of your business by a lot more than you're paying them. That's the critical factor. And where do I go for help? Well, you go to people who are experienced in this. You go to an accountant, you go to a lawyer, and you go to a very respected business broker. So, rapidly approaching the 40-minute mark after I said it would take 25 to 35 minutes, this is the basic blueprint for moving things forward. I want you to talk to your family first and foremost. Think about some options, determine the value gap, put in place the time frames. What sort of time do we actually have to make this happen? Get a plan and start now. Right, I will move on to the very last slide, which of course is the offer. As my marketing person would always insist, we must always finish with an offer. So here is the offer. If you would like help to fast track your sale ready process, we can offer you a complimentary sales ready warrant of fitness, and all you need to do is email me at the email which is on your screen, and I will tee up the appropriate meeting to make it happen. If in another 10 minutes you think of a question that you were desperately keen to ask but you forgot, once again, use the email address, send an email direct to me, and I can let you know within 24 hours any answers that you so desire. Jamie, that's about all I have at this end. Is there anything you'd like to wrap up with?
Nothing from this end. There are a couple of questions that have come through, but what we'll do is we'll answer those via email afterwards, just because of the time in front of us. So Jeremy, thank you very much for your time today, and everyone else, thank you for attending. As Jeremy said, any questions at all, please email them through to jeremy@successgroup.co.nz, and I hope you got some good value out of this. I know I certainly have. So Jeremy, thank you very much for your time today.
Cheers, guys.